My name is Ethan Barker, and I am a music education and composition major here at WT. Today, I'd like to give some insight as to how communication technology directly affects my life as a musician and its practical application in every aspect of what I do. Firstly, I'd like to start with the personal application of it, the professional application of it, and kind of the disadvantages and advantages of both. Firstly, I'd like to start with the personal aspects and how personal communication apps like Instagram, Facebook, and social media in general helps me as a musician. Personal communication is key for me in interpersonal collaboration with my colleagues in music. For example, there's an app called the Band app, and I'm sure you can guess as to what that's used for. The majority of the information I'm needing in my ensembles and whatever information I would need for dates of recitals and things like that all go through the Band app. And I find the Band app incredibly useful when it comes to finding information and having it and putting it into calendars and things like that. Secondly, personal communication builds an environment of consistent information sharing. Like with the Band app, there are a lot of social media apps like it, like for example, Instagram and Facebook. All of these apps have the ability to share that consistent information about when recitals are, when things are due, and also live streams. It also gets our music out there in a way for people long distance to be able to see. Lastly, one of the most important personal aspects of communication is that it reminds my friends and family of important things. And like I said with the recital dates, it keeps the long distance family and friends in the loop, and it really shows them what I'm doing at school. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the professional aspect of communication and how it's used in my life as a musician. And in regards to professional communication technology, I like to call that like email or Canvas or like phone calls and text. That would be the more professional communication in my world. Like I said, with the more informal communication, like the personal information sharing, professional communication does exactly the same thing, but on a more professional basis. For example, one of the most important communication aspects that we use as musicians is email or phone calls. If we want results for auditions or if we want results in general, the majority of them are going to be through the email. Like if you get, for example, if you apply for a symphony and you want to find out what the results are, the majority of the time it'll either be communicated to you by email or a phone call. Secondly, another important thing in professional communication that we can observe is Canvas. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Canvas and referring to it as a professional communication device, considering the fact that majority of teachers don't necessarily want to use this as a professional communication device. They'd prefer it by email. At least in my experience, majority of educators prefer to use email or phone calls or things like that instead of Canvas, but we can see Canvas as a professional communication technology. Lastly, I'd like to go over the disadvantages of both. One of the biggest disadvantages that we can see within technology is its over-reliance that we have built upon it. I know for myself as a musician, I am addicted to TikTok, and I feel as if that is my biggest source of procrastination is that technology, is that personal communication technology. It can be just as distracting as it is, conveying information. Over-reliance on digital media can really overcomplicate things who also prefer analog technology. So for those of us who aren't really addicted to using the computer for every single thing, using an overt amount of digital media can overcomplicate things for individuals. Secondly, personal communication for professional events may not even be seen by all. Majority of people, for example, my grandparents, who don't really get out of their house much since they're getting older, they're not necessarily going to be kept in the loop on Instagram or Snapchat or things like that. They're not necessarily going to be kept in the loop like that. Specifically because that's not something they grew up with. It's not something that's a staple in their life. Therefore, personal communication for professional events may not be seen by all musicians or by all people in the field. Lastly, one of the biggest disadvantages is professional communication can relay important information in a less emphasized format. We can always get an email, but that email doesn't necessarily tell us the information that we need. For example, you could get an email about a really important date, but it could be moved to your junk folder and could be relayed in a completely incorrect way when this email is extremely important in the long run. I know I've had a handful of emails myself. I've received emails and they don't necessarily go through, or they're not necessarily emphasized, just because they're kind of put in the junk folder, or they're just kind of glossed over, because the way that we view email, the way that we see everything, it's almost like everything is at the same value, unless you mark it as important or whatever. It's kind of just seen as information. And one of the biggest disadvantages of digital media communication that we can see is that it kind of gets washed out in the stream of information that we receive on the daily. Overall, just to tie everything together, there are big advantages to personal and professional communication technology in my life as a music educator and as a performer. And I find that this class was very helpful and useful in identifying what exactly those communication technologies are and their more practical application in regards to myself as a musician and as a future educator.